When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word, and he healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases.
Matthew 8:14-17 could be simply taken as just another example of Jesus' healing, and on the surface it is. But taking a look at the author and understanding his intentions when writing the book, and digging deeper into the verses show an even deeper meaning. In Matthew 9:9 we found out that Matthew is a tax collector. Now in those days, a tax collector was considered the lowest of the low, the disloyal Israelite looking out for Roman interests versus the Jewish ones. In Matthew chapter 10, we find out that Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples, one of his chosen inner circle. And unlike the letters written by Paul, there is no authorship established. Matthew doesn't say he's writing the gospel, but tradition tells us that Matthew is the author of the first book in the New Testament. There is no firm date on when Matthew wrote the gospel. But based on the fact that there's no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem that took place in AD 70, scholars believe it was in the late 60s AD. Matthew was a Jew that followed Jesus. Based on his reliance in his gospel of Old Testament fulfillment, Matthew is writing to the Christian Jews of his time. Now, the Jews would have known the Old Testament scriptures, and he's using Jesus' fulfillment of these scriptures as proof that Jesus is the Messiah. So where did the story take place? Well, if we combine Matthew's version of the story and Mark's version of the story, we know a couple things for sure. One, it took place in Peter's house. Two, Peter's house was in Capernaum. And three, it took place on the Sabbath. Chapter 8 begins with Jesus coming down the mountain after a long day of teaching. He meets a man on the road with leprosy and he heals him. He meets the centurion and heals the centurion's servant. So by the time he got to Peter's house, he was probably tired. There are verses in the Bible that tell us that Jesus felt power leave him whenever he healed someone. So chances are he was going to Peter's house to rest for the evening. When Jesus got there, instead of being able to rest, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. Now, scholars believe that where Capernaum was geographically located, this was probably malaria that she was suffering from. Jesus went to her, touched her hand, and she got up and began to wait on him. In verses 16 and 17, Matthew talks about what happens later in that evening. He says in 16, when evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. Matthew says he did this to fulfill a prophecy from Isaiah 53. And that prophecy reads, he took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. This was a prophecy of the Messiah. But why did Matthew choose to put these two stories together? The first is a story about healing. We just read that Jesus healed the leper. We read that Jesus healed the centurion's servant. And now we read that Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. And then he puts the fact that Jesus is fulfilling prophecy right after that. Well, the prophecy part is easy to explain. Matthew used Old Testament fulfillment of prophecy throughout his gospel to prove to his readers that Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophecy, that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah. But the first part is a little confusing. Why give another example of Jesus healing? When we look at this passage a little bit further, we see a couple things stand out. Jesus had just come down from the mountain and he was escaping the crowds. So it was Jesus that was there. We know that Peter's mother-in-law was there. Because it was Peter's house, we believe that Peter was there. And maybe there were a couple other disciples there. But there's no mention of the disciples, and there's no mention of anyone else being there. Matthew puts this in to talk about how Jesus did this. He healed Peter's mother-in-law not to wow crowds, but to show that Jesus was the same when he was in public or when he was in private. He didn't do this to wow crowds, to win people over. He healed Peter's mother-in-law because he could, because he wanted to, and because he cared. So what can the modern reader take from these passages? Well, the first thing we can take is the example of Jesus. To be the same person in public that we are in private. To be the same caring, loving follower of Jesus. Remember, Jesus didn't do these things to wow crowds. He didn't do these things to win people over. He saw Peter's mother-in-law sick. He cared for her and he healed her. William Barclay, in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, says that these verses are to show that Jesus was not one of those that was best in public and at their worst in private. So we should be the same. We should follow that example. The second thing we can take is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the prophecies, and Jesus is the Messiah, and we can count on that. And the last thing, I've read this passage a number of times. I've skimmed over it a number of times. I didn't see this passage of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law as anything important. It wasn't until I stopped and studied them that I realized what was really going on here. So I encourage you, don't just skim the passages in the Bible. Take a good in-depth look and let's learn from them.